Welcome back. We're now in presentation 2 of our Super Monday afternoon summer distance grad presentations. Our second one for this afternoon, Kevin Cox, Voices in the Wilderness, Journalists and Faith. Journalists and Faith.
You put them in the same phrase, Jody.
Kevin, we're in your hands.
Thank you. Well, just in following up on that, Jody, I mentioned this to one of my sources down on the South Shore. He's a local reporter quoted in the study. He says, "You're going to explain in 30 minutes what we do to a room full of ministers?" He says, "Well, God bless you with that." I said, "I only hope it does." The question we had is, how do journalists with strong religious beliefs experience their faith on the job? And I'll tell you how it was with me. February 1989, I was running out of a hotel room in St. John's. I was the Atlantic correspondent for the Globe and Mail, running out to cover a spy trial. Phone rings. There's a really angry woman on the phone. You could hear the pain in her voice. Says, "How dare you profane the name of God on the front page of that newspaper today?" And I had led off the story on the sexual abuse of young boys by the Roman Catholic clergy with the quotation from Luke 17:2. "It were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he be cast into the sea than he should offend one of these little ones." And the next paragraph said, "There are many millstones being hanged about the heads of priests in Newfoundland, and there are many offended little ones." And I replied to the one, I said, quote, "Was accurate. I found it in the Gideon's Bible. It was in the hotel room." And she says, "You wouldn't even know what those words mean, and you should show respect for those who do." And I responded glibly, hoping to get her off the phone, to tell you the truth, that I thought God could use some good public relations right about then. She replied, "Well, he doesn't need them from the likes of you." And she slammed down the phone. The likes of you? You wonder what journalists are like. She assumed that someone from the evil secular world of the Globe and Mail was in no position to quote the scriptures. There are widespread assumptions that we're causing people to click off God, that the people who work in the media are godless social liberals who have little interest in religion and are often antagonistic towards it. One media critic in the States, Marvin Olasky, wrote that the media have redefined reality to exclude the spiritual realm. And he says, "Many editors of the past century have tried to publish God's obituary." Asian media critic C.K. Lal says the media have replaced the church. You'll be happy to hear this. The media have replaced the church as a religion of the middle class in democratic societies. And this is a quote from him. It says, "It creates its own fantasies." The media does, to calm the nerves of strugglers and strivers, like the freedom of the press and right to information are fundamental beliefs of the faith. The media has its own saints, celebrity talk show hosts, star reporters, syndicated columnists. It has its own priesthood of politically savvy editors, world-wise marketers, management wizards. And unlike religions of the past, however, the media does not have a holy scripture. It lacks a comprehensive guide for the people to help them live virtuous lives. Well, I really had no intention of writing God's obituary, and nor have the 4 journalists we'll hear from. But this project comes out of 4 decades of reporting in the mainstream media where I have wondered where God was in a wide range of tragedies, including the West Drake coal mine, and where 26 miners died in 1992, Swiss air crash where 229 passengers died in 1998, sex abuse cases involving priests, and even once when I had to go out to Shubenacadie to find the image of Madonna on drywall in a house. You wonder, where is God in all this? Well, the subjects of my survey speak of their struggles in balancing the idea of objectivity with their religious faith. And this is a key point. They're supposed to be objective, but they're dealing with stories with strong spiritual elements many times. You'll meet a Roman Catholic who tries to control his disgust and righteous anger as a television reporter, and even guilt as he covers sexual abuse of boys by priests. An Anglican foreign correspondent who sees his faith restored by the actions of priests battling apartheid in South Africa. We have a newspaper reporter who's conflicted as he writes about a monastery being forced out of a wilderness area by the logging activity of the same company that owns this newspaper. We have a regional reporter who is a former Pentecostal minister who provides live hits from a tragic car crash that killed a 2-year-old child, her mother, and her grandmother, and they were all from his church. Does that sound like writing God's obituary? I'm not sure. This project looks at journalists who, you often have to push your religious beliefs to the background, and this is a key point. In a hectic 24-hour, 7-day news cycle, putting out this kind of, I suppose the Tower of Babel would have enjoyed this. A lot of that there. There was agreement amongst all my people and myself that work in the mainstream media affords little time for, puts even less value on reflection, provides sparse coverage of spiritual matters. This project deals with 4 veteran journalists. Their careers actually span 40 years. We see their work in relation to religious faith and the impact that faith may have on what the public watches, hears, and reads. And equally important here is the impact that seeing humanity at its very best and its very worst has on the religious faith of journalists. Well, we get to the research. There wasn't much. In fact, there was next to nothing available on the religiosity of journalists. None of the 4 I interviewed had ever discussed their religious views or their involvement with any other colleague, which kind of shocked me. A questionnaire survey, one of the pieces I did find, one questionnaire survey of over 1,000 journalists in Canada and the US got a 31% response rate. It did conclude that religious values are intertwined with the impulses that guide journalists in their professional activities, but journalists aren't aware of this. And then at the end of this huge study of about 25 pages, they concluded that it wasn't valid because the sample size was too small. That wasn't helpful. So I did my own methodology. I suppose it was phenomenology, although a lot of it was narrative. Journalists talk in story almost entirely. So trying to talk theory was almost impossible. But I did 4 interviews, and I did a self-interview, sort of a heuristic involvement, and to see what my own experience would reveal. I did look around the group when I stood up, though, and I realized I've told most of you these stories already, so some of them I'll leave out. The journalists spoke in anecdotes which revealed a great deal about their faith and the approach they took to their jobs. So we'll meet them briefly. We have a former Pentecostal minister who became a journalist. We have a national media outlet reporter who shares leadership of Christian education in the Anglican Church. We have a regional television reporter who's a former altar boy in the Roman Catholic Church and a frequent reader. And we have a retired national columnist, religion editor, and foreign correspondent who summed up his church involvement with, "I sing in the choir whenever they'll have me, and I preach when they don't want me." So I guess that was what he was doing. And I worked for 6 years in provincial daily newspapers, 23 years with the Globe and Mail, and about 10 years with the electronic business daily allnovascotia.com. I should mention at the outset there is a flaw in my research, which I readily acknowledge, is these were 4 men. They were all suggested to me by people in the business that I asked, both men and women, pointed to these people over and over again. I think for future study, it'd be really interesting to interview 4 women and see exactly where their faith lies. But those are our voices. And journalists are the priests and scribes of the information religion. They're preoccupied with the issue of defining what is truth, as we saw on the last slide. Opinions compete to decide what truth is. They would probably concur with Christ that the truth will set you free. We also use the one, ask and it will be given unto you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. And then we get this one, which is probably the more frequent view of the public. And I also thought the Christian church, in chaos and conflict, preaches, "Comfort my people, O Israel," even when that means concealing facts that might disturb the faithful. Well, what does the wilderness look like? That's kind of it. If these are the high priests, that's the cathedral. Media newsrooms force eclectic groups of people together, not unlike religious orders. Many journalists, like clergy, we have a lot in common, are introverts, sometimes egotists, loners, often very talented but eccentric. There are myths about hard-bitten, driven news people, cynics, supposed to be heavy drinkers, self-righteous hypocrites. And funny thing, the public still depends on them to defend democracy. Oppose the police state, stand up for the weak and vulnerable, and celebrate the best and denigrate the worst. So I thought I'd see what an actual journalist would describe the business like. In Ego and Ink, a book on the creation of the National Post here in Canada, journalist and author Chris Cobb says, it is, quote, a unique, addictive business, packed with quirky, awkward personalities. This doesn't sound like the church at all, does it? Who, without newspapers, might have nowhere else to go. The former Pentecostal minister told me he felt exactly like that when he left the ministry. He said, I felt quirky and I had nowhere to go. And the workplace can be the courthouse, the House of Commons, council chamber, a murder scene, civil war, hockey rink, or maybe just a desk with a phone like we see here. One of the themes I encountered was what I call sharing the vacuum. None of the journalists could point to a single conversation they'd ever had with another journalist about spirituality or religion in a newsroom, ever. And I had to say it was true of myself. One reporter spoke of a culture of secular materialism that rarely spoke of religion or spirituality, and this is a quote, inevitably when you're around a bunch of people in a newsroom, the infection you're not going to catch is Christ. That's the sadness. I've never encountered a journalist coming up to me and say, I'd like to try prayer, or I'd like to go to church. That probably tells me more about how I'm behaving. Probably I'm not showing it well enough, but there does seem to be in that environment a big hurdle for anyone to jump to become Christian or to explore Christianity. And the foreign correspondent was really interesting. This guy had been in journalism for about 45 years, and I said, how do you experience this? How do you experience the vacuum? A good 20 seconds, I timed it. He said, I never talked about my faith or my relation to the church. And his voice kind of shook. He said, I kept it all to myself. And this was the key point. To be completely honest with you, and he was almost just quivering, he says, I've never liked journalists that much. My friends were outside journalism, he said, with one exception. And a television reporter said, I never talked about religion in the newsroom. You might talk about spirituality a little bit, but you'd never talk about how it moved you on a story. And he pointed out that many stories are not tied into religion. So I thought, well, I'll go to the one who was a former minister, because he'll tell me how faith worked in the job. He said, I never talked about it. They perceived me as a minister who was a journalist. And he told me why. He said, when you talk to people and try to say you believe in God, that God should influence your decisions and will influence your decisions, they want nothing to do with you. It's as though you're some kind of heretic. You're a dangerous person. And that's a sad thing. And the next theme that I came to, I call it overturning the tables. Journalists, these are young boys from the Mount Cashel Orphanage in happier days in the 1970s. All the journalists acknowledged they were passionate about their work, and they found their faith backgrounds were really useful in dealing with stories about organized religion, but they said, we don't do many stories about organized religion anymore. One fellow said, unless it's dealing with the election of a pope or perversity, it's not going to make it. And often that passion that they had emerged in contentious issues about their faith. And this was quite a touching story. The television reporter, former altar boy, found himself writing about the sexual abuse of boys by the Roman Catholic clergy. And he had been in the Mount Cashel Orphanage in the 70s to get footage for a story at a Christmas raffle. And he said, I'll never forget it. When we were finished shooting, some of the boys asked us, please stay with us. We said we had to go. It's late in the afternoon. We had stories to do. And then when all this broke about the sexual abuse, I thought, why did they want me to stay with them? What was happening? It tormented me. It bothered me a lot. Evil like that has got to be purged. He said, so I was doing all the stories I could get. He said, I'm still doing them. It becomes important. You don't want this to go on. And then the tension when I asked, I said, well, how did that affect your faith? Well, what really shook and the thing that bothered me wasn't my faith in Christ. It was my faith in the church as an organization. It was, how can you deny this? How can you cover it up? Someone believes in God. The children were so important to Jesus Christ. How can you not come clean? And he said it wasn't even a crime. It wasn't even a sin. Another story we ran into, you'll notice these people talking story all the time. A story involving a group of monks in a wilderness area who felt their monastery was being threatened by a logging operation run by the same industrial giant that owned the newspaper. This is a fellow was writing for. Said, quote, I like these monks. And that's one of the problems in journalism. You like people. You feel an affinity for them. And I felt their position in the world of advocating for silence amidst a world of industry encroaching and taking predominance in so many ways of life. It was an essential counterbalance. That's that be still and know I'm God thing. He said, quote, it was sad to watch them have to capitulate. And then we get the tension. I said, what'd that do to your faith? And he said, well, it's about a struggle between God's reality and what C.S. Lewis calls the treaty with reality most of us live with. That's the treaties we sometimes don't want to go to. Falsehoods, and we hold on to those things desperately. And it takes a conflict to shatter that. He said, I felt the monastery story was doing that. This one was quite... I asked the local reporter if he'd ever run into something where his faith influenced what he did. And he said, well, there was a young mother who was convicted of shoplifting. It was in a rural area. He said, at that time I was editor of was a community newspaper. And like all community newspapers, it had a policy of printing the names of everyone who appeared in court. She pleaded with him. She said, I'm a single mother. I'll lose my job. You print my name. What good does it do you to print my name anyways? And he got quite emotional during the interview. He said, I said to her, look, the courtroom was full when we were there. It was only you. If it was only you and me, it'd be fine. But there were 100 people there. And they know that that's our policy to cover all that happens. And what about those other people? They don't want their names mentioned either. I really don't have a choice here. And he put his hands on his hip. He stood up from his chair and said, so I told her, I'm not going to grant the request. I said, well, what'd that do to your faith? And he said, he almost broke down. He said, I cried most of the night, knowing here was a girl who might lose her job because of something that I did. And when I asked, he said, well, what's that do to your Christian conscience? And he said, that was all my Christian conscience. He said, otherwise, if you didn't have a conscience, you could just say, too bad. You could do that, and you would do it. It's done every day. You just say, too bad. He said, you know, being a Christian is very, very difficult. I said, boy, they could write that one over some churches. But the foreign correspondent said that he really lived out a social gospel. And he said, I modeled it on conversations I had with an Anglican primate. He said it really came into play when they asked about objectivity. He said, well, I was a religion editor when the Anglican Church refused to bless same-sex relationships. He said, wasn't going to serve balance. I wasn't going to do balanced and objective coverage. And I said, where did you learn that? It wasn't in my journalism school. And he said, in the days of apartheid in South Africa, I had a government official lecture me on that. And he said, we had to provide balanced and objective coverage of the white supremacist government. And he said, I thought to myself, this is BS. I'm not going to be balanced. It's racism. It's the same thing with the Anglicans and the split over homosexuality. There was no rational argument. This was homophobia, and I'd be damned if I was going to be objective or balanced about homophobia. It was just plain nonsense. Afterwards, I can ask him what he really felt about it. But, interviewees were really quick to tell stories, as you can tell, but they were really reluctant to point to examples of how their theology and their view of God's role in the world had affected their work, and how it might have altered how they reported issues and events. It's called making connections. They also rejected the idea that they were somehow divinely called to their roles in the media. Now, I know that makes you wonder sometimes, but the foreign correspondent said, I never took it as far as saying, I'm doing this because God put out the call to me. I'm pretty sure if I did do that, it was fleeting, because I would have found that arrogant. He said, but I went through a lot of inner journeying when I was in South Africa, and I came back angry. I had to throw in the corollary. You also came back because the South African government threw you out. And another correspondent said that he doesn't separate his religious faith from any facet in his life. He said, it's in how I treat my next door neighbor, how I treat somebody I'm interviewing, how I treat my colleague on a given day. He said, the challenge to your faith is an all-encompassing thing. And I thought that could be written over some churches too. But he also pointed out the religious faith expressed in blogs for someone in the public arena can be dangerous. Quote, there are certain barriers to what you can say publicly about something, and that's my treaty with reality. What if somebody read something in a blog and misused it? That person could go, my supervisor's not Christian, and say, I'm biased. And this is key. He says, it's not the way Christ wants us to operate out of fear, but that's reality. That's the challenge. To speak your faith publicly as a journalist is not particularly a safe thing to do for your job. Sometimes I think it comes down to personal theology. In the Swiss air crash, I still remember this vividly, being in the darkness, seeing some of the debris in the water from a boat and thinking, my first approach was, what has God wrought? I still remember those words going through my mind. And actually, my broadcast colleague said, I didn't think about that at all. He said, I just said, God be merciful to every one of those people. And I said, well, what about? I know you're not supposed to argue in these interviews, Jody, but I couldn't help it. I threw it out there and said, but what about? What has God wrought? He said, spirituality comes in as you deal with death, one death at a time. This isn't an individual tragedy. This is 229 tragedies. You don't think, what has God wrought? You know that somebody screwed with the electrical system and 229 souls were dispatched. And then a key point, the spiritual part is one at a time. And when we deal with death, we call this death at the door. Now, some of you will be shocked to hear about this journalistic practice, but it's called the death knock, where a journalist seeking an interview or a photo knocks on the door of a bereaved person, often hours after the death of a loved one in a tragedy like a plane crash, military conflict, car accident, workplace fatality. I can speak from personal experience, it's soul-searing. It involves negotiation and confrontation. It often involves the clergy. More often than not, it ought to involve the clergy as an intermediary between the 2 points, but that's an aside. It brings the journalist and the bereaved person, and sometimes the clergy person, face to face with their own mortality. My television reporter was renowned for his ability to get interviews with families of victims. I'd never seen anybody better. And he said, I'll never walk up to a door with a camera. I want them to understand I want to talk to them, but they don't have to talk to me. I said, well, what do you do with your faith? And he said, I don't ever ask them how they feel, but I ask them how they're getting through their grief, and if their faith does help them get through it. I have to ask that question, because I think it's my faith that I would expect would help me get through. And this is his personal theology, which was really interesting. See, I don't believe that God takes people. I really don't. God's got you anyways. I think whether it's in a random acts or a disease, I don't believe God makes you sick. I just don't believe those things. It's life and it's death, and that's the way it is. And there's a very touching story from the minister was a journalist, and he talked about the mother and her daughter and the 2-year-old who were killed in an accident, and he covered it live on the air, and he said, he really had trouble controlling himself. He said, they were members of my church, and I had to cover that. It was devastating. It was almost impossible. But who was going to do it? I had to do it. But it happened in the morning, and I still stayed at work. I still did my duties, but I was a basket case. I was a mess. And when the time came, I went to be with the family and help the family, but there's no backup person at the radio station. You can't go to a shrink. You can't take the day off. You just keep going. God must give us strength, and I don't know how I got through that day. And then they said, what'd you do? And he said, I went back to the family that night for a couple of hours. And then he said the key part was, you die 1,000 deaths. You go and you cry with the family, you pray with the family. He said there were 11 people in that family. I guess God gives you the strength. Otherwise, how or why would you do it? And the other episode that we did deal with was a journalist who had theological training. He said, it helps me understand the situation a bit better. He said, but I don't push for the interview. If they say no, I'm not going to push. And he told me a very touching story about a helicopter crash. And he said, there have been some times when I've broken with my faith, and he said, I think there's some times that all I can do is go down on my knees and seek forgiveness from God. And there's a key point. He says, there's times I've done it well, and I've really told their story. And there's times I've done it badly, and I felt enormous pressures, competitive pressures to talk to somebody about grief or what they think. And, I still feel guilty about it, and in some ways, I've almost blotted it out. And there was regret there, but there was also a sense of triumph. And speaking of triumph, we have redemption. We have those faith-moving moments. As we've seen, journalists consciously and subconsciously push their religious beliefs into the background. trying to get the story out and understand and form, get past that babble we talked about a little while ago. But journalists regularly witness death and tragedy, as you see in the photos here, scandal and sorrow, occasionally a good day, celebration, consolation, and they really challenge the religious faith of the witness who seeks divine order in the chaos. Because in journalism, there's not a lot of order. But this was a key point. My foreign correspondent told me the reaction of priests to the brutal enforcement of apartheid in South Africa. And he remembered, this is a famous confrontation in Cape Town. He said where Bishop Tutu and the priests confronted government forces who were moving in to halt the protests. And he said, coming down the street, Tutu led his priests out of the cathedral, and they knelt down on the street in front of those armored cars. So it was the courage of these people and the conviction that God was watching over their shoulder, standing side by side of them as they fought against apartheid. And his voice really broke at this point. And he said, it had a profound effect on me. It was the last time I drifted away from the church, and that was 26 years ago. And the reporter with the national agency encountered the work of the Christian church when he was a freelancer in South America. This is often true. You do your best work when you're not working for somebody. That never happens in ministry, I'm sure. But before he had any denominational affiliation with a church, and he said, I'd go to Peru and I'd say, who do you talk to about an interesting development to help the poor? And soon I'd be interviewing a Jesuit priest or someone who was involved in that fundamental way of giving up themselves for something greater, something bigger. He said, I kept on encountering those kind of individuals. And he told me a wonderful conclusion that he'd reached to from the tragedies. I said, that lifts you up. What pulls you down? And he said, it's important to me that truth is revealed, if it's there. And powers of materialism in this world don't always triumph. He said, I've never covered an accident when there wasn't in the end some portion of it caused by greed, or when you peel things away, it endlessly confirms the doctrine of original sin. Great deal of reflection going on there. And my television reporter told me that basically his faith had developed because he met people and events that gave him a mature view of religion. He said it wasn't a routine and a tradition, it became a faith. And I held on to it. And my local reporter said he found about consequences on the job. He said, as a minister, I always said, God is love. You know that? That's all you need to know. He said, I realized on the job that God says, don't do this. I don't want you to do this. If you do, there's consequences. And when the consequences come, we say, how can God allow that? He said, I never thought about that as much as I should have as a reporter. He said, but as a minister, you deal with that a lot. People exercise free will, and the consequences are devastating sometimes. So in conclusion, I just say that what I found out in this study, which was quite a personal journey for me, was that those with strong religious faith rarely look for the divine in the midst of chaos and tragedy, and you can see why that happens. But they do encounter it with their religious role models, healers and hypocrites, saints and sinners, and it influences coverage, whether they know it or not. There is often reflection. There's also outrage. There's compassion and there's caring. And we saw that in all those stories. And I really think journalists should be more open about their own spirituality and the impact of their work, even the impact of the work on themselves. And I think church leaders need to be more involved in what the media does and to contribute to debates about social justice issues. I think we're on the same side. I think we've got intersections here. Because we're both seeking truth. We're both seeking social justice. And if my critic Lal is right and the media are the new middle-class religion, then the religious community needs to be in the midst of it, to protest the cult of celebrities and materialism that's out there. It dominates that new faith. We have no idea how many journalists have deep religious faith, but I proved in the study that some do. The church needs to nurture this, and I think it's happening. The Pope and some of the Roman Catholic bishops, including local Bishop Anthony Manzini, have actually started talking to journalists and asking them about why do you do the things you do? The Pope in his mission statement last week said, how can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market drops 2 points? It really drove it home to me that society needs spiritual voices with the courage to actually dwell in that media wilderness. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank thank all the people who came out today, but I'd also like to thank particularly my 4 sources, because it took a lot of courage for them to actually do the interview about something they'd never talked about before. And we had some pretty intense sessions. One guy told me, he said, "You're making me live through 40 years of this." And he said, "And it's a good thing." And I said, "In the end, my conclusion at the end of it was, it restores my soul too." So I'll be happy to take any questions.
Questions? Lawrence?
Lawrence.
And Rob.
Kevin, one of the common threads that I hear from pastors is the sense of the privilege of being in the presence of people at deep moments when their sense of meaning is shattered or when they're discovering new meaning. Would you say journalists, especially the people that you talk to, feel that same sense of privilege? Because journalists also are very often have opportunities to draw near to people in just those same moments.
Very astute, because you've captured a great deal of what I said to do, Lawrence, because it is true. But I think the sensitivity is often lacking because of the pressures, the competitive pressure to get that stuff out. And there's almost a disdain, shouldn't say disdain, there's almost a reluctance to say, I don't understand enough about this, what the person's going through. I just need a clip, I need a quote. And I went through that personally. Through many years I said, that's all I need. And then I came here and took the stages of grief from Jody and suddenly realized there's so much going on here. We're doing a lot of damage. And that's been one of my personal crusades about the death knocks, is we ought not to do those for 24 hours till people have been able to assemble. But you have a very good point, because I don't think there is the sensitivity there. In fact, I found at the journalism school at King's, where I teach part-time, they had never taught the stages of grief. We were sort of sending people out there and saying, well, just get what you can get. And you can make a mess of people. I don't have to tell you people that. You know this. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I wonder if you can think for us a little bit about theological or spiritual resources that might be available to folks in these professions who I assume are living with a degree of cognitive dissonance between their own interest in the truth and telling a good story and the pressure to sell soap.
Yeah. Yeah, very good point. The resources are few and far between, but I think part of what I encountered here, which I didn't expect, was there was a great deal of interconnection, as you could see, but there was a great disconnect. There was a sense of, I'm alone. Each of the person I talked to, it struck me. They would say, I'm alone in this. I'm struggling my way through this. And I said, because they were all anonymous, I couldn't say, well, if you went over and talked to this guy, it'd be okay. You would understand. But I thought there was that. The lack of resources is a very good point, because I could find nothing. And I just found when I came over here from doing journalism for all 38 years or something, I found an awful lot of connections, but I found it very difficult to draw them, to draw the two worlds together. And when you try and tell people they're connected, they laugh. I noticed when Jody introduced this subject, people laughed, which was kind of telling, actually. But thanks, Rob. That's a very good point. And David.
Kevin, I'm just wondering, in the wilderness now, or the landscape of journalism, many, or at least some journalists, are not hiding their faith or their other biases. And I'm just wondering what your take on it is. I think of the journalist who accosted David Suzuki, one of our modern icons, and they're just unabashed now about coming out, this is my perspective, this is what I represent, and now you're going to get it over the head, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And is there conversation of some kind within the journalism community that says, you know, is there no standard, is there no way in which we can look at each other and say, you know, maybe some of these things are or not?
It's a very good point.
Within the pale of
very good
journalism.
Point, because I asked people, actually, one of the television reporters, the television reporter in this case is a master of confrontation. And I asked him, I said, did you ever just get fed up? And he said, only once. He said, it was the bishop, the Roman Catholic bishop, and he said it was when Bishop Leahy was charged. And he said, I asked him, I said, how can you have let this go on for all those years? He said, and I immediately felt embarrassed. because he said I had confronted him based on my own emotions. And David, you make a good point, because journalists are trained to approach from fact. I'll throw a fact at you, where a fact contradicts, we go back and forth. But what we're seeing more and more is these direct confrontations, like the Suzuki one's very famous, and thank you for raising that. And the question is, do you do that? Because you do it with your political views, you do it with your economic views, but
Well, the
religion
political and economic masters are saying we pay your salary.
yeah, you got it there too. Yeah, strangely the church doesn't. But yeah, it's a very good point, because spirituality comes into it, but I see nothing wrong with it. I think it's important to have those conversations. Now, it can get hostile, but it does in the other spheres too. So, but it's also a new style of journalism, which I'm not a big fan of, which is basically jam the camera in and see what comes out, as opposed to reflecting and saying, what is it we want to know? What do we need to know from this? But the confrontation style, because of CNN and 24-hour news, has become a very good point, because it's been everything. And none of the people I interviewed were really proficient at that style of journalism, of directing a confrontation. They seem to back away from it.
Yeah. Is there any forum, though, in which journalists kind of talk that over a bit? Or is
No.
it?
Sadly, what I discovered was no, and I had always experienced it that way, that the newsroom was kind of the wilderness, that you were supposed to be objective, and the objective, which I say nobody can be objective because you're influenced by 100 things, but there was a sense of, I'm objective, and then we say, well, how are you objective? You know, you were born in a certain community, you were born with certain parents and certain biases, and you went through certain schools, there's all those influences. And I think we try to be almost robotic sometimes, and it doesn't work, because eventually surfaces, or they quit. That's the other thing that happens. That's the other thing I forgot to mention, is the burnout rate, which is it was very rare when I started, okay, that was when we were still chipping stone tablets, but when I started, it was very rare to see anybody over the age of 35 as a reporter. Now you see more now, I think, but it was very rare, because they burned out. They went to other forms of work, because it was so intense and so little reward at the end of it. David.
I'm wondering about the tension between some of the macro points that you're touching on. For example,
Yes.
between faith and journalism on a large scale, and how your focus on journalists with faith relates to that, in a sense. And so what I'm thinking about is, I saw a report recently which was on CNN's religion stories over the past 12 months. And one of the interesting things that it looked at was basically just like column inches, or basically was online inches given to various stories. And of all the Protestant denominations, because of the papal election, Roman Catholic Church received most attention. But of all the Protestant denominations, it was really fascinating. The one which has got most media coverage on CNN over the past 12 months is Westboro Baptist Church, which
Thank
has
you, yes.
like about 30 members. And so there's a sense in which, what's driving that? What's driving that level of focus? Is there ideology driving that level of focus? Is it simply market driving that level of
Oh,
focus?
excellent point.
And
yes.
can you touch on those questions, or to what extent can you touch on those questions through the very deep, really important, significant lens you've chosen to look at, which is the personal, the phenomenological?
Yeah, very good question, David, because my theory, I've spent a lot of time studying actually exactly what you're talking about. I couldn't get it in here, but thank you for raising it. It'll be in the paper, Jody. You're looking forward to that. Well, the Westboro phenomenon is really interesting because they simplify everything. They get it down to a clip, and they can put it out in 30 seconds. Well, I was thinking, when you look at some of the issues that were outlined here, the issue with the monastery, how do you put that into 30 seconds? What silence is worth in the world? And I covered part of that story, not nearly as well as the reporter who I referred to in here did, but I remember asking that question, and the nun at the monastery went on for half an hour. Yeah. And I said, I can't deal with any of it. And it's a very good point, but Westboro puts it down and says, okay, war is wrong. Yeah. Therefore, they shouldn't give military funerals to these guys coming back. Yeah. And then you say, okay, good. There's a counter argument to what society believes is right. And there's the other thing that they do, is they counter society. So you've got an angle as a journalist, say, there's a good angle. That's even better than covering the actual funeral. Right. And so there's this human nature. But as you point out, there is that marketplace of ideas out there, and there's buyers and there's sellers. And sometimes you want to turn over the tables. But I think that's a really interesting question because of reflect. But I think what happens is if journalists start talking about reflection and start mixing back and forth with people like yourselves, they start to see things deeper and say, okay, there's more to this. And there's nothing that the media like better than something that's deeper, something that hasn't been explained. Because then you'll look like a genius. We don't have any of those, but you can look like one. But the Westboro one thing has plagued all of us. Yeah. And me personally, I've really felt ground by it. Because I said, why do they get in there all the time? Yeah. And then I wonder, are we not speaking out? Are those on the illiberal side of the church not speaking out? Are we scared that we're going to get slapped down by these people, or we're going to attract, I think the other thing with religion journalism, we're going to attract, I hate to say it, but we'll attract a lunatic fringe. And we'll be lumped in with them, and there's this fear. And I think if there's an exchange of views, and there's a good exchange of views, that doesn't happen. But we haven't had that yet. We've had the popes and perversity coverage.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael.
Two questions,
Yes,
Kevin. Just to turn it around a little bit, to what extent are the church and theological colleges not successfully playing in the outreach, in if you want to call it the media game,
yes.
And in that they simply are not present in the debate? I know that's not quite the focus of what you're looking at.
Very good point, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you could just answer that first.
Yeah, I'll take that one first. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we found here a fairly lively community. I've seen Dr. Dean quoted many times in various places, and Rob and Mary and Lawrence, and I could go on the whole group here. I think we don't do it. We do it reactively, though. We wait till the media gets the story, and then they come to us and say who we can get. And I've done that 100 times. Who can I get? Give me a quick clip. But we need to be like the other way, proactive, and say, I think this is worth looking at. And the Westboro case is a really interesting one. If you went and said, I know you ran the clip from them saying this, that they should not be giving honors to people coming back from the war. Well, there's an element of just war that we might talk about. How about Augustine's view of just war? Can't we look at that? There's a countering view. And you open up the dialogue and say, it may not be a story today, but it may be down the road. And you make a good point. I don't think we have jumped out there. And certainly the mainstream clergy, I was talking about the mainstream media, the mainstream clergy in their churches tend to just back away. Look, I've got enough to deal with pastoral care. I've got enough to deal with developing liturgy. I haven't got time to go out there and solicit the media for what I'm doing. Well, if we keep going like that, you'll find out how quickly this religion of the middle class becomes exactly what isn't in the scriptures there. How much time do people spend reading newspapers, watching online publications, and watching television news as opposed to reading that book? I'm not going to ask you for I'm not going to do a survey, but it'd be really interesting. There'll be cards on the way out, yeah. That's my second project, yeah. Michael, did you have another one?
Such a good answer.
Did I confuse you to the point where you couldn't get the thing? I've seen people do that at press conferences, Michael. So
Other questions? Lawrence.
Just to explain to you, Kevin, while I am sometimes quoted on behalf of AST in the media, it is usually the most junior reporter, whatever the news outlet is, who is tasked with creating some filler, which may or may not see print or see the airwaves early the next week, who at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon phones this place she's found in the phone book usually, and guess who's the only faculty member available to take the call?
You shouldn't work Friday afternoons, Lawrence. Oh, you people have a system.
No, I'm not, actually.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. No, it's a very good...
That goes to show the priority, and recently King's journalism students have been trying to find a religious angle, And I've
Yes.
had several calls and conversations with journalism students. But again, it's very clearly the one who got the short stick and is calling late on Friday afternoon.
There's an interesting study actually being done at King's, for the King's Journalism Review, on religious editors in the country and how there's only 4 or 5 left. In fact, every newspaper had one. We're down to 4 or 5. But what it's showing, the preliminary parts of it are showing, is that it's always a junior person in the editorial staff who gets that job. And I actually interviewed the one fellow who used to be religious editor of the Globe and Mail. I said, "Did you ask for that?" I had to admit he said, "I don't like your tone of voice." And I honestly didn't realize it had crept in. And he said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "I'll tell you why." And I said he was going to give me some deep reflective. And he says, "The Pope was coming. I knew I was going to be on the front page for a whole month." But he said once I got into it, I realized there were huge issues that were not being covered. And he said they were being covered when a decision was made. He said the same-sex marriage thing. He said it was covered when the decision was made. He said by somebody who didn't even know the decision was coming. He said at least we were able to have the debate. And there are places where I think it does happen, like the National Post. I like their Holy Post thing there. And they actually have a person, that's all he does. But that's just, and then strangely enough, that's because of Conrad Black, which is kind of strange, but Black actually was the guy who said this deserves to be talked about. And other places like the Globe have now gone back to having sort of a social trends person report religion, and I don't think it's done very well. And that's, when I looked at these people with religious faith, I thought, why aren't these people doing it? Why aren't the people who know it? And I've often said that about, just to conclude, I've often said that when they send people, and you've all had it happen probably, somebody comes to cover an Easter service or a Christmas service because they need a quick clip for the news that night about the religious holiday, they send a junior person who hasn't got a clue what's going on. Why wouldn't you send somebody who understands the religion and say, okay, what is the theological significance of Christ's birth? Or what is the significance of the resurrection? Do people really believe that anymore? What is the resurrection? Instead of, okay, 200 people gathered at the cathedral, it's Easter, move on to the bunny show, kind of that kind of thing. But it is, you make a good point with the junior reporters, because you wouldn't send somebody who doesn't know what the stock market is to cover the closing. I just worked for 6 months at the Globe before I was ever let anywhere near that stuff. You have to train. Well, you don't for our sphere.
Which is a tragedy. Conrad Black has always been very active in his church for a very long time. Anglican, now Roman Catholic. Goes to church regularly, well, at least when he's not in prison. But I suspect
maybe he did there too.
I suspect he goes to chapel regularly too, which would make for a fascinating conversation. A journalist friend of mine said, one of the realities about news is it changes every day. So we don't have the time necessary to actually delve into it, to actually explore the implications of the story, because a new story emerges tomorrow or in the next few minutes, the next few hours. So something just quickly transpires. And one of the luxuries of the church is actually the time when we can sit down and move into issues, talk about issues, explore issues. So maybe it would be great if at some point some journalists and theologians sat down and actually spent an evening wrestling with issues, and then people around say, what are they talking about tonight in church? What are they exploring tonight? What are they trying to unearth tonight? I think for a very long time when we thought about people following Augustine or following the great fathers of the church and the mothers of the church, it was because they're asking really critical questions for the world of its time. And it seems to me that's something we can do, and you've certainly given us an ear to that, and perhaps as we've seen throughout, new ideas and new perspectives. Kevin, well done. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.